Durango, Colorado, 1896. A monster blizzard has swallowed the mountains alive. A 5-year-old boy is dragged barefoot onto a porch in 20 below wind chill, and his stepmother pours a bucket of ice water over his head. "You're nothing but bad luck," she hisses, slamming the door. The lock clicks. Snow buries him in seconds. Then a single, savage bark tears through the storm. A silver-gray dog barrels out of the whiteout and plants himself over the freezing child. A scarred cowboy reins in hard, scoops the boy inside his coat, and disappears into the howling dark. They just woke a killer who will murder to keep the past frozen forever. One little boy, one loyal dog, one stranger who should have kept riding, who lives and who dies tonight. Comment right now. Would you have stopped? Subscribe. The miracle starts in 3, 2, 1. Durango, Colorado, December 1896. The storm had teeth. For 3 days it had raged down from the San Juan peaks, driving snow sideways in sheets so thick a man could lose sight of his own outstretched hand. Main Street lay buried. Only the tops of hitching posts and the faint glow of saloon windows showed where the town had been. The Animas was frozen hard enough to carry a loaded wagon, and the wind that scoured the valley carried a bite sharp enough to flay skin in minutes. Folks who had to be out walked hunched, scarves iced stiff across their faces, boots punching through the crust, only to sink again. This was mountain winter at its meanest. Not pretty, not merciful, just a slow, patient killer that waited for mistakes. Half a mile above town, where the wagon road climbed into black timber and the wind had room to howl, the McAllister Ranch sat exposed on a bare ridge. The house was low and solid, built to take punishment. Hand-hewn logs dovetailed tight, chinked with clay and horsehair, roofed in cedar shakes, now hidden under a 3-foot blanket of snow. A thin ribbon of smoke fought its way up the stone chimney before the gale ripped it apart. Inside, the big box stove glowed cherry red, throwing heat that reached the table and the beds but never quite made it to the corners. Levi McAllister stood barefoot on the cold puncheon floor, 5 years old and small for it. His black hair stuck up in wild tufts, uncombed since his father's burial. A sweater that had once belonged to Josiah McAllister, cut down, recut, and still too big, hung past his knees, sleeves rolled twice. His feet were already blue at the toes. In his arms he clutched a reindeer-hide teddy bear, rough-sewn by his father's own hands, its button eyes loose, one ear hanging by a thread of sinew. The hide still carried the faint smell of wood smoke and the lanolin scent of his father's hands. Levi pressed it to his chest like a shield. Abigail Rook watched him with winter-pale eyes. 34, tall and narrow through the hips, she had the kind of cold beauty that made men look twice and then wish they hadn't. Her blonde hair was twisted up tight with bone pins, not a strand out of place even in the heat of the stove. She wore a dark green wool dress beneath Josiah's old buffalo coat. The collar turned up around her throat. Her voice, when it came, was flat and precise, the way a person speaks when shouting is unnecessary, because the listener has nowhere left to go. "You've worn out your welcome, boy," she said. "Your pa's 6 weeks in the ground, and you're still here, eating food that ain't yours, breathing air that ain't yours. Time you learned what the mountain does with things it don't want." She moved fast, one hand clamped around Levi's upper arm, thin fingers, strong as baling wire, and dragged him toward the back door. The teddy bear bumped against his ribs with every jerking step. The door opened, and the storm lunged in, roaring, slapping them both with snow that stung like buckshot. The temperature outside was 20 below before the wind. With it, far worse. Abby stepped just far enough onto the porch to keep her own boots dry. In her other hand, she carried a galvanized bucket. Water sloshed inside, filmed with ice that had formed while it sat by the door. She upended it without ceremony. The water hit Levi like a club. It poured over his head, down his neck, soaked the heavy sweater in an instant, ran in icy streams down his legs and between his bare toes. The shock stole his breath. He opened his mouth, and nothing came out but a thin, soundless wheeze. His knees buckled. He dropped hard on the splintered porch boards, water already freezing in his hair and on his lashes. From the warm side of the doorway, Gideon Slade leaned against the jamb, arms folded, enjoying the show. 38, built like a freight wagon, he had shoulders wide enough to block the light. A thick black beard framed a mouth that always looked ready to sneer. A pale scar ran from the corner of his left eye to the hinge of his jaw, clean, straight, earned with a Bowie knife in a Silverton alley. He wore a sheepskin coat open over a red flannel shirt, thumbs hooked in a cartridge belt that had seen plenty of use. Gideon had drifted north from the San Luis Valley the spring before Josiah died and had never quite drifted on. "Bar the door, Abby," he said, voice low and satisfied. "Cold'll finish what we started." Abby didn't answer. She simply stepped back inside, swung the heavy plank door shut, and let the iron latch fall with a dull, final thud. The key turned once in the lock. On the porch, Levi tried to stand and couldn't. His legs had gone wooden. Snow blew in under the eaves, settling on his soaked shoulders, melting for a heartbeat against his skin before freezing again. His teeth chattered so hard he tasted blood where he bit his tongue. He curled around the teddy bear, hugging it tight, as if the scrap of hide could still keep the warmth in. Inside, the stove crackled. The smell of coffee and frying pork drifted under the door, close enough to torment. Outside, the wind kept screaming, the snow kept falling, and the mountain began its patient work. The storm had swallowed the world whole. There was no horizon, no ridge, no sky, only a moving wall of snow that erased every track the instant it was made. Reed Callahan rode hunched forward in the saddle, coat collar turned up, hat brim pulled low against the wind that knifed straight through wool and leather alike. Smoke, his big black gelding, plodded on with the stubborn patience of a horse that had seen worse winters and knew arguing with them did no good. Snow packed into the folds of Reed's sheepskin coat and froze there, adding weight with every mile. At his left stirrup ran Valor, 9 years old, lean as fence wire, coat the color of fresh ash under moonlight. The dog moved in a steady, ground-eating trot, ears flat, amber eyes narrowed to slits against the driven snow. Valor had been born in a line shack during a January blow just like this one. He treated blizzards the way other dogs treated sunshine. Nothing to fear, only something to work through. They had left the high camp above the timberline at dawn, meaning to check the herd bedded in the shelter draws below the ridge. The storm had come in faster than the almanac or the old-timers had guessed. By noon, the world had closed down to 20 yards of gray-white nothing. Reed trusted Smoke's sense of direction and Valor's nose more than his own eyes now. He was a mile past the old McAllister place, or where he reckoned it ought to be, when Valor suddenly stopped dead. Ears snapped forward. A low growl rumbled in the dog's chest. Not the sharp warning of a wolf or bear, but something deeper, urgent. Valor swung left, off the faint track, and plunged into the drifts without waiting for command. Reed reined Smoke after him. "Easy, boy. What you got?" The dog was already quartering the slope, head down, tail stiff. 20 yards on, he began to bark, short, explosive bursts that carried even through the howl of the wind. Reed caught a flicker of yellow lamplight ahead, half buried in the white, the McAllister house. He hadn't meant to come this close. The place had stood empty since Josiah died, and folks said the widow had gone south. Yet a lamp was burning, and Valor was making straight for the back porch like a bullet for the breech. Reed swung down, boots punching through the crust to his knees. He looped Smoke's reins over a buried fence post and followed the dog. The wind hit him full in the face, stealing breath, stinging his eyes to tears. Valor reached the porch first and began scratching at the planks with frantic paws, snow flying in frantic puffs. A thin, reedy sound cut through the gale, a child's whimper, half frozen. Reed's stomach turned to stone. He vaulted the porch rail in one motion, landing hard beside the dog. There, curled against the house wall beneath the overhang, was a small boy, soaked to the skin, lips blue, black hair iced into spikes. The child's eyes were open but unfocused, fixed on nothing. In his arms he clutched a sodden scrap of hide shaped like a bear. His bare feet were already wax white. Reed dropped to one knee, yanked off his gauntlets with his teeth, and touched the boy's cheek, cold as creek ice. "Jesus God!" Valor whined and shoved his muzzle under the child's arm, trying to lift him. Reed scooped the boy up without thinking. The little body weighed next to nothing, limp as a half-empty feed sack, yet the chill coming off him burned through Reed's coat like dry ice. He pressed the child against his chest, inside his open coat, skin to skin, the way you warm a newborn calf. The boy's head lolled against his shoulder. A faint shudder ran through him, the only sign he still lived. Inside the house, a door slammed. Bootsteps. A man's voice, thick with irritation. "Abby, what in hell's that racket?" Reed's head snapped up. Through the frosted window, he saw movement. A big man in a red shirt, beard black as coal, a woman behind him pulling a shawl tight. The lamp flame wavered as the back door started to open. Reed didn't wait. He turned, boy cradled against him, and plunged back into the storm. Valor bounded ahead, breaking trail. Smoke stood hip-shot where he'd been left, snow caked on his mane. Reed swung up with the child still clutched to his chest, pulled the slack of his coat around them both, and kicked the horse into motion. The wind swallowed the shouts behind them. The yellow light of the house vanished almost at once, erased by the whiteout. Reed bent low over the saddle horn, shielding the boy with his body, and let Smoke and Valor pick the way down the ridge. Snow filled their tracks in seconds. Behind them, on the empty porch, the bucket lay on its side, a thin skim of ice already forming across the spilled water. Reed's line shack sat in a narrow pocket where two ridges pinched together, and the wind lost most of its punch. A man could ride within 50 yards of it in summer and never notice the place. In this storm, it was invisible. The single room was 12 by 16, built of squared pine logs caulked with moss and mud, roofed in split cedar that had silvered with age. A lean-to on the north side sheltered Smoke. A low shed held split firewood stacked tight as corduroy. Smoke steamed in the dark, grateful to be out of the gale. Inside, the stove, a squat, pot-bellied army surplus model Reed had hauled up on a mule 10 years ago, roared like a small cannon. The air smelled of pine pitch, coffee, and wet dog. Valor lay sprawled on the packed dirt floor, sides heaving, tongue lolling, but his eyes never left the boy. Levi was stripped down to skin and wrapped in 2 Hudson's Bay blankets and Reed's spare wool shirt. Reed had rubbed him hard with a rough towel until faint color returned to the small cheeks, then laid him on the lower bunk closest to the stove. The child's breathing was shallow but steady. Every few minutes a tremor ran through him, as if the cold still hunted inside his bones. Reed knelt, feeding the fire another chunk of pine. The flames threw long shadows across the log walls, and the few possessions a man needed to stay alive up here. A Winchester 73 leaning in the corner, snowshoes hung on pegs, a battered coffee pot black with years of use, a shelf of canned tomatoes and Arbuckle's coffee. No pictures, no mirrors, no softness. He glanced at the boy again. The reindeer hide bear lay on the bunk beside Levi's head, still damp. One button eye had come loose and dangled by a thread. Reed picked it up, turned it over. Something hard shifted inside the stuffing. Valor whined and nosed his hand. "Yeah, I feel it too," Reed muttered. He drew his skinning knife, hesitated only a heartbeat, then slit the seam along the bear's ragged ear. A small, flat object slid out into his palm. An iron key, old-fashioned, with a bow stamped First National, Durango, and the number 217 cut deep into the shank. The metal was still cold, as though it had carried the winter with it. Reed's jaw tightened. He knew that bank vault, knew the heavy door, and the brass cages, and the clerk who always smelled of bay rum. He also knew Josiah McAllister had kept a box there, back when the ranch still turned a profit. The boy stirred, a thin sound escaping his throat. Reed set the key on the shelf and poured a tin cup half full of coffee, then thinned it with hot water from the kettle until it was barely brown. He lifted Levi's head gently. "Drink, son. Slow." Levi's eyes fluttered open, dark, huge, still glazed with shock. He sipped obediently, coughed, sipped again. Warmth reached his stomach and he shuddered harder for a moment, then relaxed by degrees. Valor inched closer until his big head rested on the edge of the bunk, amber eyes fixed on the child. Reed sat back on his heels. "What's your name, boy?" A whisper, barely louder than the stove. Levi McAllister." The name hit Reed like a hoof to the chest. He had ridden for Josiah McAllister 20 years ago, before the man's lungs went bad and the bottle took over. Had eaten at his table, slept in his bunkhouse, watched him dandle a black-haired toddler on his knee. That toddler was lying here half dead from cold. "Your mama do this to you?" Reed asked, voice low. Levi's chin trembled. "She ain't my mama. She's Abby. Pa married her last year. Pa got sick real fast. Then he was gone." His small fingers found Valor's ear and clung. "She said I bring bad luck. Said the mountain ought to have me." Reed felt the anger rise, slow and hot, the kind that didn't shout but settled in the bones and stayed. He banked it. There would be time. "You're safe now," he said. It sounded like a vow even to his own ears. Outside, the storm kept its siege, rattling the shutters, piling snow against the door until the cracks glowed with packed white. Inside, the stove crackled. Valor's tail thumped once against the floorboards, and Levi's eyes drifted shut again. The key on the shelf caught the firelight and threw back a dull, steady gleam, patient as the mountains themselves. Reed pulled his chair close to the bunk, Winchester across his knees, and settled in to wait for morning. Whatever waited down in Durango could wait one more night. Tonight, the mountain would have to come through him first. Dawn never really broke. It only thinned the darkness a shade. The storm had eased to a steady snow, windless snow that fell straight down in fat, silent flakes, erasing the world one layer at a time. By the time Reed pushed open the shack door, the drifts reached the bottom of the window. Smoke and Valor plunged ahead, breaking trail, while Reed carried Levi bundled in every spare blanket and his own spare coat. The boy weighed next to nothing, but the responsibility felt heavier than a winter's hay crop. The ride down took 3 hours instead of 1. Snow swallowed sound. Even the creak of saddle leather seemed muffled. Levi rode in front of Reed, wedged between the horn and the man's chest, the reindeer hide bear tucked inside the coat with him. Valor ran alongside, ears crusted white, never more than a length away. Durango looked abandoned when they finally reached the edge of town. Roofs sagged under the load, chimneys coughed thin smoke, and the only tracks on Main Street were those of a lone riders or dogs. The First National Bank squatted on the corner of 9th and Main like a red brick fortress, its iron-barred windows frosted solid. A hand-lettered sign on the door read, "Closed until further notice. Storm." Reed didn't bother knocking. He looped Smoke's reins to the hitching rail and carried Levi straight around to the side entrance used by clerks. Old Harlan Wade, the bank president, opened the door himself, spectacles fogged, scarf still around his neck. He took one look at the snow-crusted man, the half-frozen child, and the wolf-colored dog at their heels, and stepped aside without a word. Inside smelled of coal oil, ink, and warm wax. The lobby was dim, lamps turned low to save fuel. Harlan led them past the teller's cages to the vault corridor. Boots and paws left wet prints on the polished floor. "Box 217, Reed said, producing the iron key. His voice was hoarse from cold and lack of sleep. Harlan's eyebrows rose, but he only nodded. "Been unopened 15 months, since Josiah passed. Taxes went unpaid after that. County was fixin' to seize it come spring." He worked the big outer wheel, then the inner gate, and finally slid out the long steel drawer. The hinges complained like an old man getting out of bed. Reed set Levi on a wooden bench. Valor immediately lay across the boy's feet, a living hot water bottle. Harlan retreated to give them privacy, pulling the corridor door until it stood ajar only a hand width. Inside the box lay 3 things. First, a thick legal envelope sealed with red wax impressed by Josiah McAllister's signet ring, a running horse inside a circle. Second, a leather-bound ledger, pages stiff with age. Third, a small glass vial no longer than a man's thumb, stoppered with cork and wax, containing a few grains of pale powder and a folded scrap of paper. Reed broke the seal on the envelope. The document inside was written in Josiah's careful, slanted hand. "To whomsoever finds. This, if I am dead before this box is opened, know it was no accident. Abigail Rook, my wife of 11 months, and Gideon Slade have conspired to take the ranch and all holdings. They have poisoned me slowly with arsenic obtained from rat bait. Proof is in the ledger, purchases, dates, witnesses paid to lie. The vial contains the last dose I saved from my evening coffee. Protect my son Levi. He is all that is left of me. Give him the ranch when he is of age. God forgive me for trusting the wrong woman. Josiah McAllister, October 14th, 1896. Reed's hands were steady, but the pulse in his throat beat hard enough to hurt. He opened the ledger, page after page of neat entries. Arsenic bought from the mercantile under false names, payments to a doctor who never existed, forged withdrawal slips bearing Josiah's signature. Shaky at first, then steadily worse as the poison took hold. The vial rattled faintly when he lifted it, enough left to kill a grown man twice over. Levi watched with huge eyes, not understanding the words, but feeling the weight in the air. Valor's ears flicked toward the corridor. A low growl vibrated in his chest. Reed closed the box, slid it back, and locked the gate. Harlan cleared his throat from the doorway. "That the McAllister boy?" "It is. His stepmother has been telling folks he ran off in the storm, said he was touched in the head with grief." Reed's smile had no warmth in it. "She'll have a different story to tell the circuit judge." He wrapped Levi up again, the documents and vial tucked inside his coat next to his heart. Outside, the snow still fell, soft and relentless, already covering their tracks from the hitching rail. Valor paused on the boardwalk, looked back once toward the high ridge where the ranch lights would be burning, and growled again, quiet, certain, final. Reed swung into the saddle and pulled Levi up in front of him. "Time to ride, son," he said. "We've got law to fetch and a reckoning to deliver." The town watched from behind frosted windows as the tall man, the ash-colored dog, and the small boy disappeared into the white, heading not up the mountain but straight down Main Street toward the sheriff's office, where the stove would be hot and the coffee strong and the truth, at last, would have its day. They never made it to the sheriff's office. Reed had barely turned Smoke out of the bank's side alley when Valor stiffened, hackles rising like a ridge of gray knives. A low rolling growl came from deep in the dog's chest, the kind he saved for wolves or rattlesnakes. Reed followed the stare. Half a block down, where Main Street dipped toward the frozen river, two riders sat their horses in the falling snow. One was Gideon Slade, unmistakable even at a distance, broad as a barn door, black beard frosted white, buffalo coat hanging open despite the cold. The other was a hired man Reed didn't know, long and lean, scarf pulled high, rifle already across his saddle. Both horses were lathered. They had come hard and fast from the ridge. Gideon raised a gloved hand, lazy, mocking. Then he drew the Winchester from his scabbard and levered around with a sound that cracked across the muffled street like a breaking bone. Reed didn't wait for the second invitation. He spun Smoke on his hocks, kicked hard, and the big black lunged forward. Levi, wedged tight in front of him, let out a startled cry. Valor wheeled and sprinted alongside, ears flat, running flat out. Snow exploded under hooves and paws. Reed took the only route open, straight down the center of Main, past shuttered storefronts and startled faces appearing at windows. A woman's scream floated behind them. Someone shouted Gideon's name in disbelief. The first rifle shot came a heartbeat later, high and wide, splintering the shingles over the millinery shop. The second kicked up a geyser of snow at Smoke's heels. Reed bent low over Levi's small body, coat flapping open to shield the boy. "Hold tight, son. Don't let go of that bear." They hit the end of Main doing a dead run and plunged onto the ice of the Animas. The river was a white boulevard 20 yards wide, glazed hard by weeks of cold. Smoke's shoes rang like hammers on anvil iron. Valor streaked ahead, picking the safest line where the snow lay thinnest. Behind them, Gideon and the hired man thundered onto the ice in pursuit. The gap closed fast. Gideon's horse was fresh, Smoke was carrying double weight and already blown from the morning ride. Reed risked one look back. Gideon was gaining, rifle raised to his shoulder now, lining up a shot. Reed yanked Smoke hard left, toward the railroad bridge that crossed the river a quarter-mile downstream. The bridge was narrow, single track, planked between the ties, but it was cover and a choke point. If they could reach it first, Gideon would have to come single file. The ice boomed beneath them, deep, ominous groans as weight and speed tested the freeze. A spider web of cracks shot out from Smoke's hooves. Levi whimpered and buried his face in Reed's coat. "Almost there," Reed muttered, more prayer than promise. 50 yards to the bridge, 30. Gideon fired again. The bullet whined past Reed's ear and punched a neat black hole through the brim of his hat. Reed felt the heat of it, felt the hat lift and spin away into the snow. He dug his heels harder. They hit the bridge planking at a dead gallop. Smoke's shoes slipped, caught, slipped again. Reed hauled the reins, guiding by knees alone, trusting the horse's heart. Valor bounded up onto the ties beside them, claws scrabbling for purchase. Halfway across, Reed heard the second pursuer's horse scream, a high, panicked sound. He glanced back. The hired man's mount had broken through a thin patch near the far bank. Horse and rider vanished in a welter of black water and thrashing legs. Gideon didn't even slow. He spurred straight past the hole, eyes fixed on Reed, face twisted with fury. Reed reached the far side, plunged into the cottonwoods that crowded the riverbank, and yanked Smoke into a tight turn behind a stand of thick trunks. He slid from the saddle, Levi still clutched against him, and dropped to one knee in the snow. Valor skidded to a stop beside them, teeth bared, a silent snarl. Gideon's horse thundered onto the bridge planking. Reed raised the Winchester he had snatched from his scabbard during the wild ride. He didn't want to kill a man in front of a child, but he would cripple the horse if he had to. He levered around and drew bead on the bridge deck just ahead of the charging animal. Gideon saw the rifle come up. saw the dog ready to launch, saw the cottonwoods that would swallow his quarry whole. For 3 heartbeats, the only sounds were wind, panting horse, and the creak of saddle leather. Then Gideon cursed loud enough to carry across the ice, yanked his horse around in a rearing pivot, and spurred back the way he had come, coat flapping like raven wings. Reed lowered the rifle, breath sawing in his throat. Levi's small arms were locked around his neck so tight he could barely swallow. Valor pressed close, licking snow from the boy's cheek, tail giving one slow wag of relief. Reed stood, legs shaking from cold and spent adrenaline. The storm was picking up again, snow already filling the hoofprints on the bridge. By the time anyone else reached the river, there would be no sign which way the fugitives had gone. He swung back into the saddle, pulled Levi up in front of him, and turned Smoke north, toward the high parks where no road ran, and the snow lay 4 feet deep. There was an old trapper's cabin up there, long abandoned, known only to a few. "Hold on, son," he said quietly. "We're not done riding yet." Behind them, the river ice groaned once more and settled, keeping its own counsel beneath the falling snow. The trapper's cabin sat in a hollow so deep the sun wouldn't touch it again until April. Pines grew thick and tall around it, their lower branches bent permanently by decades of heavy snow. The roof was half collapsed, but the back wall and chimney still stood, and that was enough. Reed had used the place before, in harder winters, when wolves or warrants made town uncomfortable. They reached it near dark. Smoke was lathered white, legs trembling. Valor's paws were raw, but he refused to lag. Reed carried Levi the last 50 yards. The boy had not spoken since the river, only clung to the reindeer hide bear and stared with eyes too old for a 5-year-old face. Inside, the cabin smelled of mouse nests and old smoke. Reed kicked the snow from the doorway, spread his bedroll on the dirt floor, and built a small, fierce fire in the crumbling hearth. The flames threw just enough light to show the soot-blackened stones and the single name someone had carved long ago, Crockett, 1879. Levi sat wrapped in blankets, teeth no longer chattering, but body still shaking in waves. Valor curled around him like a living furnace. Reed melted snow in the coffee pot, added jerked beef and a pinch of salt, and fed the boy warm broth a spoonful at a time until the cup was empty and the child finally slept. Only then did Reed allow himself to breathe. He was cleaning the Winchester, oil rag moving in slow circles, when Valor's head snapped up. Ears pricked toward the door. A low growl, soft but certain. Reed set the rifle aside and drew his Colt. Snow had begun to fall again outside, muffling everything, yet he heard it, the faint crunch of snowshoes, deliberate and steady. One person, coming slow. He moved to the doorway, revolver cocked, and waited. A shape appeared out of the darkness. A woman, hooded in a dark wool cloak crusted with ice, snowshoes lashed to boots that had seen better decades. She stopped 10 feet away, raised both gloved hands to show they were empty, and pushed the hood back. Eleanor Ellie Finch, 47, raw-boned, face weathered like saddle leather, gray-streaked hair braided tight. She had been the McAllister cook and nurse for 15 years, ever since Josiah's first wife died birthing Levi. Folks said she knew where every skeleton on the ranch was buried, because she had helped dig some of them. "Easy, Reed Callahan," she said, voice rough from cold and tobacco. "It's only me." Valor recognized her scent and relaxed, tail thumping once. Reed lowered the Colt but did not holster it. "You're a long way from the ranch in this weather, Ellie." "Had to be." She glanced past him at the sleeping child. Her eyes softened, then hardened again. "Saw Gideon and that snake Tate ride in an hour ago. Horses half dead, Gideon spittin' mad. Said the boy drowned in the river and you shot his man off the bridge. Abby's telling the same story in town. Little Levi wandered off, lost to the storm. She spat to one side. Pure lies." Reed stepped aside. Ellie entered, bringing a rush of cold air and the smell of pine smoke. She carried a burlap sack that clinked softly. From it, she drew a battered tin box, the kind that once held .50 caliber cartridges. Inside were papers, a small black ledger, a folded letter in Josiah's handwriting, and a brown glass bottle with a skull and crossbones label, "Rat Death, Arsenic." "I was there every night," Ellie said quietly. Abby brought Josiah his evening coffee herself the last month, sweetened it heavy so he wouldn't taste the bitterness. I watched her measure powder from this same bottle when she thought I was asleep. When he started coughing blood, she told me to keep my mouth shut or I'd be next. Her jaw worked. I kept quiet too long. Reckon the mountain's collecting its debt now. She handed Reed the ledger. Columns of dates, amounts, Gideon's crude X beside each entry. Payments for silence, payments for poison. Reed's voice was almost a whisper. Why come to me? Because you're the only man on this side of the divide Gideon's scared of, Ellie replied. And because that boy deserves someone who will finish what his pa started. She reached into her coat and drew out a second item, a Colt Navy, worn but oiled, the grips wrapped in rawhide, Josiah's. Said if anything happened to him, it was to go to the man who'd keep his son breathing. Looks like that's you. Reed took the revolver. It felt heavier than lead. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the broken shutters like moans. Valor lifted his head and stared into the dark beyond the firelight, ears twitching at something only he could hear. Ellie pulled her hood up. They'll come at first light. Gideon don't leave loose ends. Reed nodded once. Then we won't be here at first light. He banked the fire low so it would burn slow, wrapped Levi in every blanket they had, and lifted the sleeping child against his chest. Valor rose without command, ready. Ellie paused at the door. There's a line shack another 5 miles north, up the East Fork. Stove still works. Nobody's used it since the Ute left in '82. She pressed a folded scrap of paper into his hand. Rough map, charcoal lines. Godspeed, Reed Callahan. She vanished into the night the way she had come, snow closing over her tracks almost before they were made. Reed stood in the doorway a long moment, Levi's small heartbeat steady against his own. Then he turned back to the fire, holstered Josiah's Colt beside his own, and began packing what little they would need for the ride ahead. The storm had given them one night of grace. It would not give another. They rode all night, pushing north through the black heart of the storm. Snow fell so thick it felt like riding through feathers, muffling every sound except the creak of saddle leather and the steady blow of Smoke's breath. Levi slept against Reed's chest, cocooned in blankets and the big sheepskin coat, the reindeer hide bear clutched in one small fist. Valor ran point, a pale ghost in the darkness, choosing the safest line between drifts that could swallow a horse whole. The line shack Ellie had marked sat at the base of Devil's Gate, a narrow notch where 2 ridges pinched together and the wind screamed through like a locomotive. The cabin was little more than a lean-to against a cliff, but the back wall was solid stone and the roof had held. Inside, a rusty Yukon stove still stood, chimney pipe miraculously straight. Reed kicked the door shut against the gale, built a quick fire, and melted snow for coffee, while Valor circled the boy like a sentinel. Dawn came gray and sullen, the sky the color of wet ash. Reed stepped outside to check the back trail. Snow had filled their tracks within minutes, but high on the ridge above the gate he saw movement. 4 riders, black against the white, picking their way down the switchback. Gideon led them, coat flapping, rifle across his saddlebow. They were coming slow but certain, like wolves that had scented blood and knew the prey had nowhere left to run. Reed went back inside. Levi was awake, sitting cross-legged on the bunk, eyes huge in the firelight. Are they coming for me? They are, Reed said. No point lying to the boy now, but they'll have to come through me first. He checked both revolvers, his own and Josiah's Navy. 12 rounds total. The Winchester held 10 more. Not enough for a stand-up fight, but enough to make it costly. He looked at Valor. The dog's ears were pricked, hackles half raised, but his tail gave one slow wag. Ready. Reed knelt in front of Levi. Listen close, son. When the shooting starts, you crawl under that bunk and pull the bear over your head. Don't come out till I call your name, or Valor licks your face. Understand? Levi nodded, chin trembling, but eyes steady. Reed ruffled his hair once, then stepped outside and pulled the door to behind him. The riders reached the bottom of the switchback and fanned out across the narrow meadow in front of the cabin. Gideon reined up 30 yards out, snow swirling around his horse and man alike. The 3 hired guns spread left and right, rifles ready. All 4 carried the hard, hungry look of men who had killed before and expected to again. Gideon's voice carried easily over the wind. Send the boy out, Callahan. Ain't no need for this to get bloody. Reed stood in the doorway, coat open, both Colts hanging loose. Boy's staying with me. You want him? You'll have to dig him out of my cold hands. Gideon laughed, a short, ugly sound. That can be arranged. He raised his rifle. The first shot came from the cliff above the cabin, not from Reed. A sharp crack echoed down the gorge. The rider on Gideon's left jerked backward, hat spinning away, red blooming on his coat. He toppled sideways into the snow. All four men looked up, startled. From the rimrock 20 feet above the shack, Eleanor Finch stepped into view, lever-action Henry across her hip, face calm as Sunday morning. She worked the lever again, chambering another round with the smooth motion of someone who had hunted elk since girlhood. "Morning, Gideon," she called down. "Thought you might need a reminder that the mountain don't belong to you." Gideon's face twisted. He swung his rifle toward her. Reed drew and fired twice. The first bullet clipped Gideon's coat sleeve. The second took the horse in the shoulder. The animal screamed and reared, dumping Gideon into a drift. The remaining two gunmen hesitated half a heartbeat, long enough. Valor exploded from the cabin doorway like gray lightning. He hit the nearest rider at the knee, jaws closing on the man's calf. Horse and man went down in a tangle of thrashing legs and curses. Reed advanced, firing steady. One gunman threw up his hands and kicked his horse into a frantic retreat up the slope. The last man tried to bring his rifle to bear, but Ellie's Henry spoke again and he slumped forward over his saddle horn, dead before he hit the ground. Gideon scrambled to his feet, coat torn, face purple with rage. He clawed for the pistol at his belt. Reed was already there. He drove his shoulder into Gideon's chest, slamming the bigger man back against the cliff face. The revolver flew from Gideon's hand into the snow. Reed pressed the muzzle of Josiah's navy under Gideon's chin. "Move, and I'll paint this wall with what's left of your head." Gideon spat blood and snow. "You're dead, Callahan. You and the brat both." Reed smiled without humor. "Maybe, but you'll be first." From the ridge above, Ellie called down. "Sheriff's posse left town at first light. Heard the shots. They'll be here inside the hour." Reed kept the gun steady. Valor padded over, teeth still bared, and sat on his haunches directly in front of Gideon, amber eyes unblinking. Snow kept falling, soft now, almost gentle. It settled on the bodies, on the blood, on the barrel of the revolver. Levi's small face appeared in the cabin doorway, eyes wide, but he did not cry. The wind eased. Somewhere far off, a horse whickered, the first sound of the approaching posse. Reed spoke quietly, for Gideon's ears alone. "Josiah McAllister says hello." Then he stepped back, gun still leveled, and waited for the law to come take what was left. April came late to the high country that year, but when it finally arrived, it came all at once. One morning, the south wind turned warm. The snow began to sag and weep from the pines, and by noon, the ridges were running with water. The animas roared bank full, chocolate brown with silt and broken ice. Meadowlarks returned overnight, their songs sharp and bright against the dripping silence. The McAllister ranch looked smaller in daylight without its white shroud. The house needed paint and a new roof in places, and every fence on the place had to be rebuilt, but the bones were sound. The corral posts still stood straight, and the big barn, though leaning, had not fallen. It would hold. Reed stood on the porch at sunrise, coffee tin cup in hand, watching the valley wake up. Smoke grazed in the lower pasture, coat glossy again, rolling in the new grass like a colt. Valor lay at the top of the steps, silver-gray head on his paws, amber eyes half closed in contentment. The dog's muzzle was nearly all white now, but the heart inside was the same. Behind him the door creaked. Small bare feet padded across the boards. Levi, 7 months older and 2 inches taller, climbed into Reed's lap without asking, the way he had done every morning since the snow melted. He still carried the reindeer hide bear, now washed, restitched, and wearing a new red calico ribbon Ellie had tied around its neck. "Morning, Pa," he said, voice still soft with sleep. Reed's arm tightened around the boy. The word had started as a slip of the tongue one night, when nightmares woke Levi screaming, and Reed had answered without thinking. It had never been corrected. "Morning, son." They watched the sun clear the eastern ridge and spill gold across the meadows. A pair of sandhill cranes flew low over the river, long legs trailing, calling in rusty voices. Inside, the smell of frying eggs and baking powder biscuits drifted out. Ellie Finch, aproned and gray braids swinging, had taken over the kitchen with the calm authority of a woman who had waited 15 years for the right to do so. She sang while she worked, an old Scottish ballad about lost love in green hills, voice cracked but steady. The trial had lasted 3 days. Gideon Slade and Abigail Rook had stood in the Durango courthouse in shackles, while Josiah's ledger, the arsenic vial, Ellie's testimony, and Levi's quiet, unflinching account of the night on the porch were laid before the jury. The verdict came back before supper on the second day. Guilty on all counts. Hanging was set for the first Monday in June. The judge, voice grave, had added that mercy might be considered if the prisoners confessed fully. Neither had. Reed had carried Levi out of the courtroom before the sentence was read aloud. The boy had heard enough darkness. The ranch came to Levi free and clear, taxes paid from the sale of Gideon's horses and Abby's jewelry. Reed was named legal guardian until the boy turned 21. The paperwork felt strange in his calloused hands, but he signed where the judge told him to. Now, 4 months later, the place was beginning to breathe again. They had 20 head of Hereford cows and a bull bought cheap from a rancher near Pagosa. Ellie kept a milk cow and a dozen hens that scratched contentedly around the yard. A new garden plot lay turned and harrowed, waiting for seed. Levi slid off Reed's knee and ran to the corral where a shaggy buckskin colt watched him with pricked ears. The boy climbed the fence and held out a handful of grass. The colt lipped it carefully, then bumped Levi's chest with its fuzzy nose. Valor rose and trotted down to supervise. Reed stayed on the porch, coffee cooling in his hand. He thought about the morning at Devil's Gate, about the weight of Josiah's colt in his palm, about the way Gideon's eyes had gone wide when he realized the mountain had finally chosen a side. He thought about the small grave behind the house where Josiah lay, the wooden marker now joined by a second, smaller stone Ellie had insisted on. A simple cairn for the size of a child's coffin, empty but necessary. A place to mourn what almost was. Ellie appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Breakfast's on. You planning to stand there all day, or you coming in before the eggs get cold?" Reed smiled, the expression still feeling new on his face. "Coming." He whistled once. Valor lifted his head, barked twice at the colt, and herded Levi back toward the house. The boy laughed, bright and unafraid, the sound carrying clean across the valley. Reed took one last look at the sunrise spreading over land that was no longer cursed, then followed his family inside. The door shut softly behind him. Outside, the snow kept melting, running in silver threads down the mountain, carrying the last of winter away. Reed Callahan used to believe miracles were only for Sunday sermons and old cowboy tales told around dying campfires. He was wrong. A miracle wasn't thunder from a clear sky. A miracle was an old ash-gray dog who refused to leave a freezing child on a porch. A miracle was a weathered stranger who chose to stop his horse in a blinding blizzard instead of riding on. A miracle was a woman who had stayed silent for 15 long years, finally finding the courage to speak in the darkest hour. A miracle was love proving stronger than greed, stronger than poison, stronger than 20 below zero mountain night. Scripture says the sun rises on the evil and on the good, and the rain falls on the just and the unjust. But sometimes, just sometimes, God sends a scarred cowboy, a loyal dog with snow on his muzzle, and a little boy clutching a ragged reindeer hide bear to remind us that even in our fiercest winters, He is still moving, one small footprint at a time, one warm heartbeat against the cold. Look around you today. Someone near you might be standing on their own frozen porch right now, soaked, shivering, feeling forgotten. Your kind word, your outstretched hand, or 1 minute of courage could be the miracle God wants to work through you. If this story warmed even the smallest corner of your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us about a quiet miracle you have seen. Let's fill this place with testimonies of God's stubborn love. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on the bell. There are more true stories of redemption waiting to be told. May the same God who melted the snow on that Colorado ridge in 1897 melt every cold place in your life right now. May He keep you and everyone you love safe in His hands, surrounded by unexpected miracles and everyday angels. God bless you richly. Keep watching for the miracles. They're still riding toward you. See you in the next story. Until then, stay warm, stay brave, and stay faithful. Amen.